Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss an emotional story that touches your heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Officer Marcus Thompson stood at attention in his crisp Royal Guard uniform. His shoulders were squared, his posture perfect, and his eyes fixed straight ahead. The golden buttons on his navy blue jacket gleamed in the early light, and the ceremonial sword at his side represented years of dedicated service to the crown. Marcus had served as a royal guard for 15 years. Protecting dignitaries, maintaining order at official ceremonies, and upholding the honor of his position with unwavering dedication today was different from his usual duties. Marcus had been summoned to testify in a high-profile case involving security protocols at a recent royal event. He had witnessed an incident that required his professional account, and he took this responsibility seriously. As he climbed the marble steps of the grand courthouse, he felt the weight of his duty pressing upon him. His testimony could affect the outcome of an important case, and he was determined to present the truth with the same integrity he brought to every aspect of his service. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, clutching briefcases filled with documents. Witnesses whispered nervously to each other, and court officers directed the flow of people through security checkpoints. Marcus moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, his military bearing making him stand out among the civilians. People glanced at him with curiosity and respect, recognizing the uniform of the Royal Guard. Some even nodded in acknowledgement of his service. He found the assigned courtroom and entered quietly, taking his seat in the witness waiting area. The room was impressive, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and rows of polished benches. At the front of the room sat the judge's bench, elevated above everyone else, symbolizing the authority of the court. Marcus studied the room, noting the exits and the layout, his training making him naturally observant of his surroundings. As he waited, Marcos reflected on his journey to becoming a royal guard. He had grown up in a modest family in a small town outside the capital. His father had been a factory worker, and his mother had cleaned houses to make ends meet. They had instilled in him the values of hard work, honesty, and respect for others. When Marcus was 18, he had joined the military, seeking a way to serve his country and build a better future. He had excelled in his training, demonstrating not only physical capability, but also the mental discipline and moral character required for excellence after 6 years in the military. Marcus had applied to join the Royal Guard, one of the most prestigious positions in the nation's security services. The selection process had been grueling. Out of hundreds of applicants, only a handful were chosen each year. The candidates faced rigorous physical tests, extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and multiple interviews. Marcus had passed every stage, impressing the selection committee with his dedication and professionalism. The day he received his acceptance letter remained one of the proudest moments of his life. His years as a royal guard had been filled with meaningful experiences. He had stood watch at state dinners where world leaders gathered. He had protected royal family members during public appearances. He had maintained security at ceremonies celebrating national holidays and historical anniversaries. Through it all, Marcus had conducted himself with honor, never seeking recognition or praise, simply doing his duty to the best of his ability. The courtroom door opened, and a clerk called several names, directing witnesses to different rooms. Marcus listened carefully, but his name was not called yet. He settled back into his seat, maintaining his disciplined posture even while waiting. Around him, other witnesses fidgeted nervously, checking their phones or whispering to companions. Marcus remained still and focused, his years of training making patience second nature. An older woman sitting near him leaned over and spoke softly. She told him that her son had once considered joining the military but had chosen a different path. She said she had great respect for people in uniform who dedicated their lives to serving others. Marcus thanked her politely, appreciating her kind words. They spoke briefly about the importance of public service and the sacrifices that came with it. The conversation reminded Marcus why he had chosen his career despite the challenges it sometimes brought. Finally, after nearly an hour of waiting, the clerk called Marcus's name. He stood smoothly, adjusted his uniform jacket, and walked toward the courtroom entrance. His heart beat steadily, not with nervousness, but with the calm readiness that came from years of professional experience. He had faced dangerous situations, protected important people during threats, and maintained composure in countless high-pressure moments. Testifying in court was simply another duty to be fulfilled with the same dedication he brought to everything else. As he entered the main courtroom, Marcus noted that it was fuller than the waiting area. Spectators filled the gallery, and several journalists sat in the press section with notebooks ready. The prosecution and defense tables were occupied by legal teams organizing their papers and conferring in whispers. At the front of the room, elevated on his bench, sat Judge Harrison Blackwood, a man known throughout the legal community for his sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach to courtroom proceedings. Judge Blackwood was in his late 50s, with silver hair, piercing gray eyes, and a stern expression that suggested he suffered no foolishness in his courtroom. He wore the traditional black robes of his office, and his reputation preceded him. Lawyers respected his knowledge of the law, but also feared his quick temper and harsh judgments. He was known to be impatient with witnesses he deemed unprepared or unreliable, and he had little tolerance for what he perceived as time-wasting. Marcus walked to the witness stand, his footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet room. The clerk approached with a Bible, preparing to administer the oath. Marcus placed his left hand on the sacred book and raised his right hand, ready to swear to tell the truth. He spoke the words clearly and firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who understood the seriousness of an oath. As he took his seat in the witness box, he looked directly at Judge Blackwood, ready to provide his testimony with honesty and precision. What Marcus did not know. As he settled into the witness chair and prepared to answer questions, was that the next few minutes would test not only his memory of the events he had witnessed, but also his character, his dignity, and his ability to maintain composure in the face of unexpected disrespect. The judge, looking down at him from the elevated bench, was about to challenge everything Marcus stood for, and how he responded would determine not only his own reputation but also the respect afforded to everyone who wore the uniform of service. The prosecuting attorney stood and approached the witness stand, holding a file folder containing notes about Marcus's testimony. She was a middle-aged woman with an air of professional competence, and she began her questions with courtesy and respect. She asked Marcus to state his name and occupation for the record. Marcus replied clearly, identifying himself as Officer Marcus Thompson, Royal Guard, with 15 years of service. The attorney nodded and proceeded to ask him about his presence at the Royal event in question. Marcus described the event methodically, providing details about the security arrangements, the number of guards present, and the specific area he had been assigned to monitor. His answers were precise and factual, delivered without embellishment or unnecessary detail. He spoke as he had been trained to report, focusing on observable facts rather than opinions or assumptions. The prosecuting attorney seemed satisfied with his responses, making notes and occasionally asking follow-up questions to clarify specific points. As Marcus testified, he noticed Judge Blackwood watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. The judge's eyes moved from Marcus's face to his uniform and back again, and there seemed to be something dismissive in his gaze. Marcus continued answering questions, maintaining his professional demeanor, but he could sense an unusual tension developing in the courtroom. Other people seemed to notice it too. The defense attorney glanced between Marcus and the judge with a slightly puzzled expression. The prosecuting attorney asked Marcus about the specific incident that had prompted the legal case. Marcus explained that he had observed an unauthorized individual attempting to access a restricted area during the royal event. He had followed protocol, first issuing a verbal warning, then physically blocking the person's path when the warning was ignored. The individual had become aggressive, claiming to have special permission, but Marcus had maintained his position until other security personnel arrived to resolve the situation. His actions had been entirely by procedure. His report had been filed immediately after the incident. Judge Blackwood suddenly interrupted, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a knife. He asked Marcus why someone in his position thought he was qualified to make judgments about security matters. The question took Marcus by surprise. He respectfully explained that security assessment was a fundamental part of his training and daily responsibilities as a royal guard. He had completed extensive courses in threat recognition, crowd management, and protective protocols. The judge waved his hand dismissively, suggesting that Marcus was overstating his qualifications. The prosecuting attorney looked uncomfortable, but attempted to redirect her questioning. She asked Marcus about his training background, trying to establish his credibility for the record. Marcus began to describe his military service and his specialized training as a royal guard. But Judge Blackwood interrupted again. This time, his tone was openly contemptuous. He remarked that standing around in a fancy uniform did not make someone an expert in security or anything else of substance. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Several spectators gasped quietly, and the journalists in the press section suddenly became very attentive, sensing that something unusual was happening. The prosecuting attorney objected, stating that the witness's qualifications were relevant to the case, and that his testimony should be heard without prejudicial commentary. Judge Blackwood overruled the objection curtly, stating that he would determine what was relevant in his courtroom. Marcus felt his face grow warm, but he maintained his composure. Years of discipline helped him control his emotions, even as he felt the sting of the judge's disrespect. He understood that responding with anger or defensiveness would only make the situation worse. He remained silent, waiting to see if the questioning would continue, his hands resting calmly on the arms of the witness chair, his expression neutral. Judge Blackwood leaned forward on his bench, his eyes fixed on Marcus with unmistakable disdain. He made another comment, this one even more cutting than the last. He suggested that people who chose careers like Royal Guard were typically those who lacked the intelligence or ambition for more meaningful work. He implied that Marcus's entire profession was essentially ceremonial, more about looking impressive than actually contributing anything valuable to society. The judge's words dripped with condescension, and his tone suggested that he considered Marcus barely worth his attention. The defense attorney, despite having no reason to support the prosecution's witness, looked genuinely uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, clearly troubled by the judge's behavior but uncertain whether to speak up. The prosecuting attorney objected again, more forcefully this time, arguing that the judge's comments were inappropriate and prejudicial. She pointed out that Officer Thompson's character and profession were not on trial, and that such remarks undermined the dignity of the court proceedings. Judge Blackwood responded with irritation, telling the attorney that she should focus on her case rather than telling him how to run his courtroom. He added that if she could not handle a little honest assessment of her witness's background, perhaps she needed more courtroom experience. The comment was designed to intimidate, to make the attorney think twice before objecting again. It was a demonstration of power, a reminder of who controlled the proceedings. Marcus watched this exchange with growing awareness of what was really happening. This was not about his testimony or the case at hand. Judge Blackwood had taken an instant dislike to him, possibly because of his uniform, possibly because of some prejudice against military or security personnel, or perhaps simply because the judge enjoyed exercising his authority over people he considered beneath him. Whatever the reason, Marcus realized he was being treated as less than equal. His service dismissed as worthless, his testimony tainted before he could even complete it. The prosecuting attorney made a decision. She requested a sidebar conference with the judge, out of the hearing of the jury and spectators. Judge Blackwood grudgingly agreed, and the attorneys approached the bench. They spoke in hushed tones for several minutes, and even from the witness stand, Marcus could see the prosecuting attorney gesturing emphatically, clearly arguing her point with passion. The defense attorney contributed occasionally to the conversation, his expression serious. When the sidebar ended, the attorneys returned to their positions. Judge Blackwood announced that there would be a brief recess. He instructed Marcus to remain available as his testimony was not complete. Then the judge stood and left the courtroom through the door behind his bench, his robe swishing dramatically. The court officers called for everyone to rise, and the room erupted in whispered conversations as soon as the judge was gone. Marcus remained in the witness stand for a moment, unsure whether to move. A court officer approached and told him he could step down but should stay in the courtroom. Marcus nodded, and returned to a seat in the witness area. As he sat down, he noticed several people looking at him with sympathy and respect. The older woman he had spoken with earlier caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. A young man in military uniform, attending the court for a different case, gave him a subtle salute of solidarity. The prosecuting attorney approached Marcus during the recess. She apologized for the judge's behavior, expressing her shock and dismay at how he had been treated. She assured Marcus that his testimony was valuable and that she would do everything possible to ensure it was properly heard. Marcus thanked her quietly, appreciating her support but feeling troubled by the situation. He had come to court prepared to do his duty, to tell the truth about what he had witnessed. But he had not expected to have his entire career and character attacked in the process, as he sat waiting for the recess to end. Marcus thought about all the men and women who served in uniform, whether military, police, or security services. They dedicated their lives to protecting others, often facing danger and always accepting lower pay than they could earn in private sector jobs. They did this work because they believed in service, in duty, in making their communities and nations safer. To have that service dismissed as meaningless, to be treated as intellectually inferior, simply because of his choice of career, felt like an insult not just to him personally, but to everyone who wore a uniform with pride. The recess lasted 20 minutes, and during that time, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense. Spectators discussed what they had witnessed in hushed voices, many expressing disbelief at Judge Blackwood's behavior. The journalists in the press section made frequent notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something newsworthy. Court officers went about their duties with professional neutrality, but even they exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they too found the investigation unusual. Marcus used the time to center himself mentally. He had faced difficult situations before, moments when his professionalism had been tested. During his years as a royal guard, he had encountered people who looked down on him, who treated him as invisible or as merely decorative. He had learned to find his sense of worth not in how others perceived him, but in his own knowledge of his dedication and competence. He reminded himself of this now, drawing on inner reserves of strength and dignity, when Judge Blackwood returned to the courtroom. Everyone rose as protocol required. The judge took his seat on the bench, and the court officer called the proceedings back to order. Judge Blackwood looked at Marcus and instructed him to return to the witness stand. Marcus walked forward calmly, his military bearing intact despite the earlier humiliation. He settled into the witness chair and waited for the questioning to resume. The prosecuting attorney began again, attempting to continue her direct examination of Marcus. She asked him another question about the security protocols at the royal event. Before Marcus could answer, Judge Blackwood interrupted once more. He made another disparaging comment, this time suggesting that Marcus probably could not even understand the legal implications of the case he was testifying in. The judge implied that people like Marcus simply followed orders without real comprehension of why things mattered. This time, something shifted in the courtroom. Several members of the jury looked visibly upset. One juror, a woman in her 40s, shook her head with a disapproving expression. Another juror, an elderly man, frowned deeply at the judge. The defense attorney, who had remained mostly silent during the earlier confrontations, stood and made his own objection. He stated clearly that while Officer Thompson was the prosecution's witness, the judge's repeated attacks on his character were inappropriate and potentially grounds for appeal regardless of the trial's outcome. Judge Blackwood turned his sharp gaze on the defense attorney, clearly annoyed that even the opposing counsel was now challenging him. He asked the attorney whether he was telling a judge how to conduct his courtroom. The defense attorney, to his credit, stood firm. He replied respectfully but clearly that he was raising a legitimate concern about judicial conduct that could compromise the integrity of the proceedings. The judge's prejudicial treatment of a witness could taint the entire case. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Everyone understood that a significant confrontation was developing. Judge Blackwood's face reddened with anger. He threatened the defense attorney with contempt of court if he continued to question judicial authority. The attorney sat down, but maintained his dignified posture, having made his point. The prosecuting attorney remained standing, ready to continue her examination, but clearly uncertain how to proceed in such a hostile environment, Marcus watched all of this unfold with a growing sense of sadness mixed with quiet pride. Sadness, because a court of law, a place that should represent justice and fairness, is being turned into a stage for one person's prejudice and abuse of power. Pride because other people in the courtroom, including the defense attorney who had no obligation to defend him, were standing up for what was right. It reminded him that while individuals might fail in their duty to treat others with respect, there were still many people who recognized injustice when they saw it. Judge Blackwood demanded that the examination continue. The prosecuting attorney asked Marcus to describe in detail what had happened when the authorized individual had become aggressive. Marcus began to answer, keeping his voice steady and professional. He explained that the individual had raised his voice, claiming to be an important person who should not be questioned. The person had attempted to push past Marcus physically, making contact with his shoulder. The judge interrupted yet again, asking sarcastically whether Marcus had felt threatened by someone simply touching his shoulder. He suggested that Marcus was exaggerating a minor incident to make himself appear more important. Marcus responded calmly, explaining that the issue was not whether he personally felt threatened, but whether protocol had been violated, and whether the behavior posed a potential security risk to the protected individuals at the event. His job was not to make subjective judgments about his own feelings, but to enforce security, measures designed to protect others. It was a clear, intelligent response, delivered without defensiveness or aggression. Several people in the courtroom nodded in agreement with his explanation. Marcus had demonstrated exactly the kind of professional thinking that his position required. He had focused on the objective situation rather than personal feelings, had referenced established protocols, and had explained the reasoning behind his actions. It was evident to anyone paying attention that Marcus was far from the simple-minded uniform wearer. The judge had portrayed him as judge. Blackwood seemed to recognize that his attacks were not having the desired effect. If anything, Marcus's composed, articulate responses were making the judge look worse by comparison. The judge's face took on a more calculating expression. He asked Marcus about his educational background, his tone suggesting he expected to uncover a lack of formal schooling that would support his earlier disparagement. Marcus answered honestly. He explained that he had graduated from high school and completed 2 years of technical college before joining the military. He had then completed various military training programs and specialized courses required for his position as a Royal Guard. These included studies in law enforcement, emergency response, diplomatic protocol, and advanced security management. He had also taken several online courses in his spare time to continue his education, including classes in conflict resolution and public administration. The answer was delivered without boasting, simply as a statement of fact. But it clearly surprised Judge Blackwood, who had apparently expected Marcus to have minimal education. The judge recovered quickly and made a dismissive comment about how such training was not equivalent to real higher education. He contrasted Marcus's background with the years of university and law school required to become a judge or attorney, implying that there was no comparison between their intellectual capabilities. The prosecuting attorney had reached her limit. She formally moved for a mistrial, arguing that the judge's demonstrated bias against her witness made it impossible for her client to receive a fair hearing. She cited specific examples of the judge's prejudicial comments and noted that his behavior was creating a hostile environment that could intimidate witnesses and influence the jury. She requested that the case be reassigned to a different judge, who could preside over it impartially. The motion for mistrial was a serious step. Everyone in the courtroom understood its significance. If granted, all the proceedings would be invalidated, and the case would have to be tried again from the beginning with a new judge. It would mean delays, additional costs, and inconvenience for everyone involved. But the prosecuting attorney clearly believed that continuing under current conditions would be even worse, potentially resulting in an unjust verdict that could be appealed and overturned anyway. Judge Blackwood responded with barely controlled fury. He denied the motion immediately, stating that the attorney was being overly sensitive and trying to manufacture grounds for appeal. He insisted that he was conducting the trial fairly and that his comments about the witness were merely efforts to test the witness's credibility, which was his right and responsibility as a judge. He warned the prosecuting attorney that further challenges to his authority would result in sanctions. Marcus continued to sit in the witness stand throughout this exchange, maintaining his composure, even though he was the center of the conflict. He understood that the situation had escalated beyond his individual testimony. It had become about larger principles of respect, fairness, and the proper conduct of those in positions of authority. He had not sought this confrontation, had not wanted to become a symbol of anything. He had simply come to court to tell the truth about what he had witnessed. But sometimes circumstances thrust people into situations where their response became more important than their intention. As the tension in the courtroom reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The main doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a distinguished-looking man in his 70s entered quietly. He wore a well-tailored suit, and there was an air of authority about him that made people turn to look. Several of the court officers recognized him immediately, and their expressions showed surprise and concern. The man was retired Justice William Hartley, a former judge who had served on the highest courts in the land before retiring 5 years earlier. Justice Hartley had been one of the most respected legal minds of his generation. During his 40 years on the bench, he had presided over landmark cases, written influential legal opinions, and earned a reputation for fairness, wisdom, and absolute integrity. He had mentored countless young lawyers and judges, and his commitment to justice had been unwavering throughout his career. Now, in his retirement, he occasionally attended court proceedings out of professional interest and concern for the legal system he had served. So long, the retired justice took a seat in the public gallery, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Judge Blackwood noticed the arrival of his distinguished predecessor and looked visibly uncomfortable. Having Justice Hartley witness his conduct was clearly not something he had anticipated or desired. The judge straightened in his chair and attempted to adopt a more professional demeanor. The prosecuting attorney, seeing that her motion for mistrial had been denied, had little choice but to continue her examination. She asked Marcus several more questions about the incident. And this time Judge Blackwood remained silent, allowing the testimony to proceed without interruption. Marcus answered each question thoroughly and clearly, providing the information needed for the case. His professionalism remained intact, despite everything that had happened. When the direct examination concluded, the defense attorney stood to begin his cross-examination. His questions were pointed but respectful, as was appropriate for cross-examination. He challenged some of Marcus's observations, asking whether he might have misinterpreted the unauthorized individual's intentions. Marcus acknowledged that he could only report what he had observed, and that determining ultimate intentions was not his role. He had followed the security protocols designed by security experts, and those protocols required him to act as he had done. The cross-examination continued for 15 minutes, and Marcus handled each question with the same steady professionalism he had shown throughout his testimony. He did not become defensive when challenged, admitted when he was uncertain about something, and stood firm when he was confident in his observations. It was a textbook example of how a witness should conduct himself under cross-examination. When the defense attorney finished, he thanked Marcus for his service and his testimony. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the attorney's character. Despite being on the opposing side of the case, he recognized Marcus's dignity and professionalism. Judge Blackwood, perhaps conscious of Justice Hartley's presence, told Marcus he could step down. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of Marcus's patience through the ordeal. Marcus rose from the witness stand and walked back to his seat in the gallery. As Marcus passed the row where Justice Hartley sat, the retired judge caught his eye and gave him a small, respectful nod. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight. Justice Hartley had seen everything, had witnessed both Marcus's testimony and Judge Blackwood's inappropriate conduct. That nod was an acknowledgement that Marcus had handled himself with honor in a difficult situation. The trial continued with other witnesses, and Marcus remained in the courtroom as he had been instructed. He watched the proceedings with interest, seeing how the case developed beyond his own testimony. Judge Blackwood appeared to be on his best behavior now, conducting the trial more properly. Though his earlier actions had already left their mark on the proceedings, during the lunch recess, Marcus stepped outside the courthouse for some fresh air. He stood on the steps, looking out at the city street, processing everything that had happened. Other people from the courtroom came and went, some giving him supportive looks or brief words of encouragement. The young man in military uniform approached and introduced himself as Private Daniel Chen. He told Marcus that he had been inspired by how Marcus had maintained his dignity in the face of disrespect. Daniel said it reminded him why he had joined the service and why it was important to uphold standards of conduct, even when others failed to do so. The prosecuting attorney also found Marcus during the break. She apologized again for what he had endured and assured him that his testimony had been valuable, despite the judge's interference. She mentioned that she was documenting everything for a potential complaint to the Judicial Review Board. Judge Blackwood's conduct had crossed lines that could not be ignored, and there would be consequences beyond this single trial. As Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, Justice Hartley emerged from the building. The retired judge walked directly to Marcus and extended his hand. Marcus shook it, feeling both honored and humbled by the gesture. Justice Hartley spoke quietly, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. He told Marcus that he had witnessed judicial misconduct in that courtroom, and he wanted Marcus to know that it reflected entirely on Judge Blackwood's character, not on Marcus's worth or service. Justice Hartley went on to explain that he had spent his career believing in the nobility of the law and the importance of the judicial system. But the law was administered by human beings, and human beings were fallible. Some people in positions of authority abused their power, forgot their duty to fairness, or allowed their personal prejudices to corrupt their judgment. When that happened, it was the responsibility of others to speak up, to hold them accountable, and to ensure that such behavior did not go unchallenged. The retired justice told Marcus that he would be contacting the Judicial Review Board himself to report what he had observed. He would also be reaching out to several colleagues in the legal community to make them aware of Judge Blackwood's conduct. Justice Hartley believed that judges should be held to the highest standards, precisely because they wielded such significant power over people's lives. A judge who could not treat witnesses with basic respect and fairness was a judge who should not be sitting on the bench. Marcus listened with deep appreciation. He had not expected anyone of Justice Hartley's stature to take an interest in his situation. He thanked the retired judge, expressing his gratitude not just for the personal support, but for the principled stand Justice Hartley was taking. Marcus explained that his concern was not primarily about his own treatment, though it had been difficult. He worried more about other witnesses who might be intimidated by such a judge, people who might not have the training or inner strength to withstand that kind of attack on their dignity. Justice Hartley nodded in understanding. He said that Marcus's concern for others was precisely the kind of character that made him an excellent public servant. He told Marcus that the Royal Guard uniform he wore represented more than just a job. It represented a commitment to service, to protecting others, to maintaining standards, even when it was difficult. Those were noble qualities, and no amount of judicial scorn could diminish their value. The two men talked for several more minutes, finding common ground in their shared belief that service to others was among the highest callings a person could pursue. Justice Hartley shared stories from his own career, moments when he had witnessed or experienced injustice and had to decide how to respond. He emphasized that standing up for what was right often came with costs, but that the alternative, allowing injustice to go unchallenged, was far worse. As their conversation concluded, Justice Hartley gave Marcus his contact information. He told Marcus to reach out if he needed any support in dealing with the aftermath of the day's events. He also suggested that Marcus might consider sharing his experience more broadly, perhaps speaking to groups of young people considering careers in public service. Marcus's example of maintaining dignity and professionalism under pressure was valuable, and others could learn from it. Marcus returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, feeling strengthened by Justice Hartley's support. The trial continued through the afternoon, and Marcus observed as other witnesses testified and attorneys presented their arguments. Judge Blackwood remained more restrained in his conduct, though his earlier behavior had already damaged his credibility with many people in the courtroom. The jury members in particular had seen a side of the judge that likely affected their view of the proceedings. In the days following his courtroom experience, Marcus returned to his regular duties as a royal guard. He stood watch at official ceremonies, participated in security briefings, and conducted himself with the same professionalism that had characterized his entire career. But internally, he was processing the events at the courthouse and what they meant for the broader questions of respect and dignity in service professions. Marcus discovered that news of the courtroom confrontation had spread widely. Several journalists who had been present wrote articles about Judge Blackwood's behavior, describing it as judicial misconduct and calling for investigation. The articles focused on how judges sometimes abused their authority. Marcus was mentioned as the witness who had maintained his composure despite inappropriate treatment, and several articles praised his professionalism. The publicity generated responses from various quarters. Marcus received letters and messages from other service members, police officers, firefighters, and security personnel who shared their own experiences of being looked down upon or treated as less intelligent because of their career choices. Many expressed appreciation that someone had stood up with dignity in the face of such treatment. They saw in Marcus's response a model for maintaining self-respect without compromising values. Marcus also heard from military veterans who had transitioned to civilian careers and faced similar prejudices. They described job interviews where their military experience was dismissed as irrelevant, or social situations where people made assumptions about their intelligence or character, based solely on their service background. The common thread in all these stories was the frustration of being prejudged, of having one's actual qualities ignored in favor of stereotypes. The Royal Guard Command took notice of the situation. Marcus's commanding officer called him in for a meeting to express support and discuss how the organization should respond. The commander made it clear that the Royal Guard stood behind Marcus completely, and that his conduct in the courtroom had reflected well on the entire service. They were considering using the incident as a teaching example in training programs, showing new guards how to maintain professionalism even in hostile or disrespectful environments. Meanwhile, Justice Hartley had followed through on his promise to report Judge Blackwood's conduct. He filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board, providing a detailed account of what he had witnessed. The retired justice's reputation gave his complaint significant weight. The review board was obligated to investigate any allegation of judicial misconduct. But a complaint from someone of Justice Hartley's stature ensured the investigation would be thorough and serious. Justice Hartley also contacted several colleagues, including active judges, legal scholars, and bar association leaders. He shared his concerns about Judge Blackwood's behavior and its implications for public trust in the judicial system. These conversations sparked broader discussions within the legal community about how judges should conduct themselves. Some of these leaders began advocating for enhanced training for judges on courtroom demeanor and witness treatment. The Judicial Review Board began its investigation by interviewing people who had been present in the courtroom. They spoke with attorneys, court officers, jury members, and spectators. They reviewed the official court transcripts, which captured Judge Blackwood's words exactly. They also examined previous complaints filed against the judge, discovering a pattern of similar behavior in other cases. Several witnesses from other trials came forward, describing incidents where Judge Blackwood had been dismissive or hostile to witnesses, particularly those from working-class backgrounds or service professions. As the investigation progressed, additional information came to light about Judge Blackwood's conduct over the years. Court officers who had worked in his courtroom described an environment where the judge frequently belittled people he deemed beneath him. Attorneys reported instances where he had treated their clients disrespectfully, particularly when those clients came from modest backgrounds. A pattern emerged of a judge who had lost sight of the fundamental principle that everyone who entered his courtroom deserved equal treatment and respect. The media coverage continued, and public opinion began to turn decisively against Judge Blackwood. Editorial writers questioned how someone with such obvious prejudices had been allowed to serve on the bench for so long. Legal commentators discussed the importance of judicial temperament and the damage that arrogant judges could do to public trust. Social media filled with stories from ordinary people who had felt intimidated or disrespected in courtrooms, and many expressed hope that this case might lead to real change. Marcus tried to stay out of the public spotlight as much as possible. He had never sought attention or wanted to become a symbol of anything. He simply wanted to do his job with honor and live his life with integrity. But he recognized that his experience had touched something larger than himself. It had opened a conversation about respect, about how society valued different types of work, and about the responsibilities of those in positions of authority. One evening, Marcus received a phone call from the prosecuting attorney from the trial. She informed him that the case had concluded with a verdict. The jury had reached their decision based on the evidence presented, and several jurors had later commented on how impressed they were with Marcus's testimony and his professionalism. His credibility as a witness had remained intact despite Judge Blackwood's attempts to undermine it. The attorney also shared that the Judicial Review Board's investigation was nearing completion. The evidence against Judge Blackwood was substantial. There was growing expectation within the legal community that serious sanctions would be recommended. These could range from mandatory training and supervision to suspension or even removal from the bench. A few weeks later, Justice Hartley invited Marcus to lunch. The retired justice had news to share. The Judicial Review Board had completed its investigation and issued its findings. Judge Blackwood had been found to have engaged in conduct unbecoming a judicial officer. The board had documented multiple instances of inappropriate behavior, including his treatment of Marcus. The recommended sanctions were severe. Judge Blackwood would be suspended from the bench for 6 months without pay and would be required to complete extensive training on judicial ethics and courtroom conduct before being allowed to return to his duties. Furthermore, Justice Hartley explained, the Bar Association was implementing new policies regarding judicial conduct. They were developing enhanced training programs for all judges, emphasizing the importance of treating all courtroom participants with respect, regardless of their background. They were also establishing clearer procedures for reporting and investigating judicial misconduct, making it easier for witnesses and attorneys to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Marcus listened to this news with mixed feelings. He was glad that Judge Blackwood would face consequences for his behavior, and that changes were being made to prevent similar situations in the future. But he also felt sadness that such measures had been necessary. He wished that basic respect and fairness were qualities that everyone in positions of authority naturally possessed. Justice Hartley seemed to understand Marcus's complex reaction. He explained that every generation had to relearn certain fundamental lessons about justice and dignity. Progress was not automatic or permanent. It required vigilant people who were willing to stand up for what was right. Marcus's example in the courtroom, his refusal to respond with anger or to compromise his dignity, had made a difference. Marcus left the restaurant feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The experience in the courtroom had been difficult, but it had also reinforced his understanding of why his work mattered. 6 months after the courtroom incident, Marcus stood in his Royal Guard uniform at a special ceremony honoring
Justice Hartley for his lifetime of service to the legal profession.
The retired justice had specifically requested Marcus's presence, saying he wanted those who embodied true service present at the celebration. The grand hall filled with judges, attorneys, law professors, and distinguished legal professionals. Marcus felt out of place in his uniform among so many in formal business attire, but several attendees approached him warmly, thanking him for bringing attention to an important issue. They explained his dignified response had sparked necessary conversations, and reforms being implemented in the judicial system were partly inspired by his example. During the ceremony, speakers praised Justice Hartley's contributions, landmark cases, articulated legal principles, and mentored lawyers. But the most powerful moment came when Justice Hartley took the podium and called Marcus to join him. Marcus hesitated, uncomfortable with attention, but audience applause encouraged him forward. Justice Hartley placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder and addressed the legal professionals. He explained that law was not just about statutes, precedents, and reasoning. It was fundamentally about people and how society treated individuals, especially those lacking power or status. Law existed to protect dignity, ensure fairness, and hold everyone, including those in authority, accountable to standards of decent conduct. Justice Hartley recounted witnessing Judge Blackwood's courtroom behavior. He described Marcus's professionalism and dignity facing inappropriate treatment. He explained the incident reminded him why he devoted his life to law, and why judges must never forget their obligation to treat every person appearing before them with respect. He said Marcus, in his guard uniform, had demonstrated more about justice and honor than many legal scholars could articulate in volumes. The retired justice addressed implemented reforms. No system could guarantee every judge behaved appropriately, but accountability mechanisms were essential. New training programs, improved complaint procedures, and increased oversight would help, but individual judges' character mattered most. He urged legal professionals to remember Marcus's example when tempted to let authority overshadow fairness obligations. Sustained applause followed. Marcus felt moved, but embarrassed by attention. He had not done anything extraordinary, simply maintained composure and continued duty. But he was beginning to understand that the most powerful statements came not through dramatic actions, but through quiet consistency in living one's values. After the ceremony, many approached Marcus personally. A young lawyer shared experiencing similar prejudice from a judge, feeling powerless. She said Marcus's example gave her courage to file a formal complaint, leading to the judge receiving counseling and supervision. A law professor mentioned incorporating Marcus's story into his legal ethics course. Teaching about judicial temperament in courtroom conducts human impact. Most touching was a conversation with a middle-aged former military nurse. She had left service 10 years earlier, sometimes struggling with how civilians treated her military experience, as if those years were wasted or her military medical training was somehow less valid. She told Marcus his experience helped her remember her service's value and renewed her confidence in her own worth. These conversations reinforced that Marcus's experience resonated because it touched something universal. Nearly everyone had experienced moments of disrespect or undervaluation. When someone in authority abused power, or when contributions were dismissed through prejudice. The specific details were unique, but underlying themes were widely shared. In following months, Marcus learned Judge Blackwood completed his suspension and training. Returning to the bench with significantly improved courtroom conduct, he was more careful addressing witnesses and more mindful of maintaining neutrality. Whether this reflected genuine transformation or fear of further sanctions remained unclear. But Marcus hoped the judge had learned something valuable, as Marcus had learned and grown. The trial where Marcus testified concluded with prosecution success. Evidence was sufficient, and his testimony played an important role despite difficulties. Justice was served despite individual actors temporarily failing their responsibilities. As time passed, Marcus reflected often on lessons learned. He realized dignity was not something others could give or take away. It was an internal quality, a choice about how to carry oneself and respond to the world. When Judge Blackwood attacked his character and profession, Marcus could have responded with anger, defensiveness, or despair. Instead, he maintained composure, answered honestly and professionally, and trusted his worth was not determined by one person's prejudice. He also learned standing up for what was right did not always require dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it meant simply refusing to be diminished, continuing work with integrity, and trusting goodwill others would recognize injustice. Justice Hartley's complaint filing, attorneys' objections, jury members' visible disapproval, and journalist coverage were all forms of standing up. Marcus's part was providing an example worth defending. Most importantly, Marcus gained appreciation for society's interconnectedness. His guard work contributed to public safety and institutional functioning. Legal professionals contributed to justice and rule of law. Teachers, healthcare workers, construction workers, farmers, and countless others played essential roles. No work type was inherently more valuable. What mattered was whether people approached their work with integrity, competence, and commitment to serving others. Marcus continued his guard career with renewed dedication, approaching each day as opportunity to embody his principles. He mentored younger guards, sharing technical skills and wisdom about maintaining values in difficult situations. He remained connected with Justice Hartley, occasionally meeting for lunch or attending legal community events where his outside perspective was valued. Marcus's story spread beyond initial media coverage. It appeared in judge and court personnel training materials, ethics textbooks, and professional development courses. Justice system improvement organizations used it as an example of why cultural change was needed. Marcus had never sought to be a symbol or teacher, but maintaining dignity, facing disrespect, became a valuable lesson for many people. Years later, after retiring from the Royal Guard following more than 2 decades of service, Marcus reflected with satisfaction. He had protected important people and institutions, served his country with honor, and maintained integrity even when challenging. Through his courtroom example, he had contributed to positive changes, making the justice system slightly better for everyone encountering it. At his retirement ceremony, attended by colleagues, family, and distinguished guests, including Justice Hartley, Marcus gave a brief speech. He spoke about loving his work and gratitude for serving. He mentioned fine colleagues over the years. He concluded with an observation capturing everything learned: every person, regardless of profession or background, had opportunity to choose who they would be and how to treat others. Those choices mattered more than titles, authority positions, wealth, or status. A person choosing integrity, respect, and service commanded genuine respect, while those choosing arrogance and prejudice ultimately diminished themselves. True measure was not in power over others, but in how whatever position held contributed to everyone's good. Applause followed as Marcus removed his uniform that evening, carefully preserving it. He felt nostalgia for his ending career and satisfaction in knowing he had served well. The uniform was a symbol of his dedication, but the true legacy was the example set, principles lived by, and small, meaningful impact made on the world around him. After retirement, Marcus remained active in his community, volunteering with youth organizations and occasionally speaking about public service and personal integrity. He stayed connected with many career contacts, including Justice Hartley, who became a close friend. Whenever hearing stories about people facing disrespect or prejudice, especially in service professions, Marcus made a point to reach out with encouragement and support. The courtroom experience that once seemed humiliating ultimately became one of Marcus's defining moments. Not because it was pleasant or easy, but because it tested him and revealed his character, in responding with dignity rather than anger, professionalism rather than defensiveness, and patience rather than bitterness. Marcus demonstrated values guiding his career, reminding many people of their importance in a world seeming to have forgotten them.